Hey everybody, welcome to the webcast. Today we're going to be talking about some covert command and control tactics that adversaries use and also some detection techniques. Before we dive into everything, as Carol mentioned, we will have a Q&A afterwards. So this is the way that you would interact with the Q&A and ask questions. If you've tuned into my previous webcasts, I love the Q&A after. So please, submit your questions and we'll address as many as we can. We have an event coming up. One of the inspirations for this webcast is the fact that I'm going to be teaching 504 soon, Security 504. And I'm going to be teaching it at this conference at the Pentest HackFest Summit. If you were listening to the pre-show banter, you heard Jason mention that I actually got my SANS instructor start at a HackFest a couple years ago when I gave a lightning talk. And so this is one of my favorite events of the year as an attendee and soon as an instructor. It starts with a 2-day summit where industry experts come and talk about various different topics, pen test related, and how pen test relates to incident response or forensic analysis or new interesting tactics for adversary simulation. Even starting your own consulting company. Last year, the keynote was about how to be a more productive pen tester and business owner. But in addition to the summit, we have 3 nights of Net Wars, which is one additional night than you usually get at a SANS conference. Coinapalooza is an interesting event. It takes place during Net Wars, but basically, if you ever took a pen test class and didn't get the coin before, say, another team was just stacked, or you were still busy studying some of the course content, you actually have a chance to win the coin here at Net Wars. So as you progress through the Net Wars levels, that'll qualify you for higher and higher level class coins as long as you took the class previously. So if you took Sec 504 in the past but didn't get the coin, if you make it into level 2 of Net Wars at Coinapalooza, then you can get the 504 coin. In addition to that, the summit also has a field trip and special challenge written by the counter hack people, the people behind Net Wars. And if you're there for the conference, you actually get a night of Cyber City, which is a full, small scale but built to scale virtual city with full industrial control systems, working traffic lights, full working model train, bank alarms, etc. So it's super exciting. It's going to be in the middle of November in Bethesda. So I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of you there. I'm going to be teaching Sec 504, the Hacker Techniques class, and that's actually the inspiration for this talk. So when I was first starting as a SANS student, my boss asked me to take the 504 class because it was incident response and it was kind of blue. And I was a hacker in training and really didn't want to take what I thought was a blue course. And I continually get this question on Twitter and through emails, people asking, oh, well, 504 looks okay, but I'm not sure if it's red enough for me. I want to do some cool hacking stuff. 504 is now one of my favorite SANS classes, and not just because I teach it. I teach it because it's one of my favorite courses. And the reason for that is, yeah, you get the incident response, and I'm not saying that flippantly, like oh well, it's a minor part of the course. It is definitely a large part of the course. But in order to learn the techniques that you'll be handling or responding against, there's actually a considerable amount of the class devoted to hands-on hacker techniques. You will be doing reconnaissance and network scanning. We actually go through simple, I don't want to worry people, but we actually go through a little bit of C and assembly code on how buffer overflows work. And then we use the Metasploit framework to launch buffer overflows at vulnerable services and actually pop shells on target machines. We do some web application hacking. We experiment with some rootkits and denial of service. And then one of my favorite modules, because it's one of my hobbies, is you actually deal with and work with some covert command and control channels as well. On top of all of that, day 6, which is generally, if you've taken a SANS class before, is the CTF day. The CTF day in Sec 504 is entirely red. It's a full pen test against a target environment where you'll be using a lot of the hacker techniques that you learned about during the class against a live fire environment. And kind of capstoning each of those sections, each of those topics that I just talked about is how to defend against them, how to detect them, et cetera, which really is our job as red people as well. It's not just a blue thing. We need to, when I find things in my job, I need to help the blue team understand how they work and how to respond and detect them. And with that, I just kind of want to jump into command and control. So a brief background of what command and control is. Command and control is a kind of a mouthful, so you'll hear it referred to as C2 or CNC, C and C, etc. But basically, it's a method to control large pools of computers, generally botnets or the like. These are kind of generalizations, but generally speaking, they're asynchronous, meaning that you issue a command, or the bot herder or the adversary will issue a command, and then a client will check in, grab that command, and then run it. And also generally it's client to server. So for instance, the client will reach out to the server won't be able to reach in. That's important because you have to deal with firewalls, and as anybody that's done some offensive engagement knows, reverse shells are your best friend because it has the target reach out to you, not you having to deal with getting past a firewall. So a lot of command and controls are generally client to server. One exception I've seen that actually works pretty well is you can use Outlook and Outlook rules as a command and control channel. We'll talk briefly about that in a little bit, but you can actually send email to a infected computer and then have Outlook intake rules run some commands for you if you want. Back in the day, one of the most traditional, like most well-known command and control or C2 channel was IRC. It was very popular in the day, and what it would happen is that in your malware, your Trojan or malicious software or whatever, you would pre-configure an IR server and channel that infected hosts, once they're taken over, would go in and connect to that server. And that way you've got all of your bots, your good little bots sitting in your IRC channel, and I can just type in, or the bot herder can just type in commands into the chat, and then the clients, which are parsing that chat, can parse out what the commands are, run whatever channel or whatever control you need. Now, I don't want to say this is easy, because there are many books and many heroic war stories of valiant incident responders and security professionals fighting to take over and bring down IRC command and control channels. But because they were IRC channels, and because they were hard-coded, they basically had to be hard-coded in the code of the malicious software. They were, once they were found, they were relatively easy to bring down. Either you could work with the ISP that was hosting that particular server and get that account taken down, or if you could wrest control of the channel itself from the bot herder, then you could, just issue commands to take down the botnet or just delete the channel or whatever. It was easy because they were easy to find, relatively easy, we'll say. So the next kind of thing that the adversaries did is they started trying to hide the C2 server itself, like obfuscate where the C2 server was. And one of the techniques that was used is a technique called fast flux. Now, most of the time when you see fast flux, it's often seen to obfuscate like phishing servers, endpoints for phishing, or malware distribution endpoints, stuff like that. But we've also seen it work with some worms and some botnets. What fast flux is, and we talk about this more in detail in 504, but basically you have your malicious domain name, and you set an incredibly low TTL for that domain name. Usually these things are like hours or days, and this TTL would be set for minutes. Sometimes, a minute. And that means that anytime a infected host tries to look up that domain, tries to go to that domain, it will say, oh, my TTL expired. I need to go back out and download the new list or whatever of IPs that this domain belongs to. The reason that's important is because you have, throughout your botnet, you have lots of malicious clients, infected clients that will register themselves as part of that domain as an IP address for that domain. And the domain servers will use something called round robin DNS to say, okay, well, these 8 IP addresses are valid at this particular time. I'm going to use one of them as the evil server. These IP addresses are only like proxies and forwarders. They're not actually the malicious domain. So one of the things we say in 504 is when you talk about hacking back, step 1 of hacking back is don't, generally. Now, there are many reasons for this, but one of them is that if you can't do proper attribution, if you're literally just trying to hack back at the IP address that your malware is reaching out to, that is likely another victim. That is likely, very, very likely, not the actual malicious server. So these bots that use these fast flux techniques will actually just forward off to the real server, thereby obfuscating what the end destination is and making it harder to track down the IRC or the whatever kind of command and control server that you need to take down with their ISP or their hosting company. Now, it's really good, as you can kind of imagine, it's really good at evading IP-based controls. With the IP shifting pretty often, it's really difficult to assign, IP-based access controls, firewall rules, IP-based blocks, stuff like that, because it's always shifting. However, it's still really vulnerable to like DNS controls. So if you centralize your DNS infrastructure and block outgoing DNS requests other than your own server, then you can start black holing, malicious domains that you find and whatnot. So it's still very difficult to fight against, and it's something that I've seen even today we struggle with as an industry. But it is something that companies themselves can fight against pretty effectively. So what do we do instead? Rather than just obfuscating the command and control server, the destination server, let's hide the actual C2 traffic. Let's make the traffic itself more difficult to discover. That way we can get our objective done before they even start hunting for us, before they even start hunting for that malicious server and blocking our DNS domains and whatnot. So the holy grail of covert C2 is to try and hide in common user traffic. So common protocols like HTTP/HTTPS, email, DNS, ICMP, these are all very common tactics for malicious or covert command and control to hide in. On top of these protocols, we use common applications like Outlook and Twitter, Gmail, Pandora, and Spotify. I've seen some command and controls that disguise themselves as Pandora and Spotify, which is kind of neat. But the reality is the more benign, the more ubiquitous the channel that you're using is, the better for the adversary, because you're kind of getting lost in the noise. You're raising that noise to signal ratio and trying to be lost in that, making it more difficult for the analysts to find you. So I've seen online lots of Twitter-based command and controls where the clients, the infected host, will reach out to a specific Twitter account and check for tweets that have command codes in them. Also, there's a command and control called GCAT, which uses Gmail emails as its command and control. And then there are more popular ones you'll see on Webcast, things like VS Agent, which was written by Black Hills Information Security, or DNS Cat by Ron Bowes. Those are 2 command and control channels that we speak at length about, and you actually use one of them in Sec 504, and you respond against another one in Sec 504 using a tool that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But I wanted to show some stuff that is a little less well known, some other examples that you won't see in other webcasts. The first one, both of them I wrote, so take that with a grain of salt. But the first one I want to talk about is something I called HttpC2. And it was written first as an experiment in writing some covert command and controls, and then kind of expanded upon as a test/evaluation for some analyst candidates. I was using PCAPs taken from this command and control as interview questions, as pre-screen questions for analysts. And it used Python and Scapy, which is a packet creation and analysis suite for library for Python. And it encoded the C2 traffic in the payload of ICMP echo requests and replies. For those of you that are familiar with ICMP, and we'll go over, if you're not familiar with ICMP, we'll go over the specifics in a couple minutes, but for those of you familiar with it, this is going to be relatively easy to detect. However, that's only true if you're inspecting and monitoring your in and outbound traffic and doing deep packet inspection, rather than just saying, oh, you know, I see ICMP going back and forth. You actually need to be able to know things about the packet beyond just, oh, that's a ping packet. So one of the other neat features that it does is it varies its beacon and response times to kind of evade detection. We'll talk about a tool that is incredibly good at detecting these kind of command and control channels at the end of this webcast. But there are tool suites out there that can look for specific beaconing behavior. And so one of the things this command and control will do is it will vary its check-in times as well as its actual command traffic times to try and evade that beacon detection. And this is a public C2. It's not very effective. I'm not worried about adversaries using it for, you know, leet ops or anything, but it's very much an instruction device. So the GitHub is available for you all if you want to download it and play around with it and check out how it works. But let's look at a regular ping. And so you'll notice a couple things in this ping packet. So hopefully you can see my mouse, but if you look at the length header, this is just a screenshot of Wireshark. If you look at the length field, this is a consistent length field across the requests and the replies and more requests, right? So very consistent length. You see an ID in hex, you see some sequence numbers here, and then you see TTLs. If you're familiar with ping and ICMP, you'll probably deduce that this is a Linux machine pinging a Windows machine. And you can tell that from, or you can deduce high likelihood that due to the TTLs. There are different operating systems, different networking stacks use different default TTLs. So even if you don't know these off the top of your head, these are listed on the internet. You can do all kinds of searching and just kind of pull up what the defaults are so you can better identify the operating systems in play. But anyways, this is a pretty standard ping packet, okay? This is an absolutely legitimate ping packet with a little bit of tongue in cheek there. If you look at the length of these ping packets, you'll see that they're all over the place. The ping request is 54, the reply is 74. This is a problem because the way that ping operates is that the echo, let's go back a slide here. So the request will have a payload. If this were live Wireshark, we'd click on that reply and we would see the same payload. The reply has the same payload as the request so that they can match it up and make sure that they're talking about the same exchange. In addition to that, the IDs and the requests or the sequence numbers are one thing, but operating systems also tend to have a default default payload. So this is the default Linux payload. You'll see this a lot throughout the various Linux networking stacks. But when you look here, you'll see that the payload is much different. In fact, it's long. This is probably base64. It's truncated for space, but this is actually a giant base64 string. And it's immediately recognizable that there's something hinky going on here if you're doing this kind of deep monitoring on the edge of your network. So as I mentioned, this is how the C2 works. It encapsulates, or I'm sorry, it encodes the C2 traffic, the request and the response inside of the payload of the ping. Also, this is an older version of the C2, so you can see the ID and the sequence numbers are just zeroed out. In the version that's on GitHub right now, it has some pretty basic logic to set an ID and pick some sequence numbers. So that should be, that's fixed there, but in this PCAP, that's not, it's still zeros. This is the version that was given to analysts, by the way. This is meant to be like a 5 to 10 minute exercise, not necessarily a crazy long analyst test or anything. But so again, pretty apparent if you're looking for it. So how do we detect things like this? Well, your IDS is likely going to alert on something like this, probably not as C2 traffic, but it might look at it as, you know, a ping of death or a potential denial of service attack, because it'll see really large ping packets coming through. If that's the case, fine, but as an analyst, if you see something like this, it should still be pretty easy to write detection methods for this sort of a command and control channel, looking for anything that isn't that is anonymous or anomalous, excuse me. So the majority of pings, like we mentioned, look exactly the same or very, very similar to each other. They have very specific kind of behaviors that they operate in. And so you can write IDS signatures or similarts for things that don't match those patterns, that are not the specific ping profiles that you would normally see. Another way, and this is kind of the holy grail in C2 detection, but beacon detection, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is also very, very useful in this. But for something as simple as the PyC2, you don't really need something like that. In a Herculean creativity effort, I developed something called HttpC2. And you'll notice that, or you might surmise that all of my creativity goes into actually writing the C2, and then I name them after the fact when the creative juices are spent and I have nothing left. And as you can probably guess, HttpC2 is something that uses, it hides their traffic within HTTP/HTTPS. This one I actually use in operations for work, and because of that, there are two versions. There's one that, like for instance, the version that I'll be showing you here is the educational version, and then a much more obfuscated, more real-world version that is used in operations. And so because it's used in operations and versions of it is used in operations, I don't have this on a public GitHub, but we'll be looking at a little bit how it works here in the next couple slides. But a brief overview, it uses cookies for the message exchange. And because it uses cookies, we're able to do a lot more granularity with it. It has a concept of different client IDs, so it can manage many, many, many clients and can kind of keep them all separated. It has a concept of, you know, previous and current version, or previous and current commands, like here is the command output and here's the command that it was run with. And it also has a much higher transfer rate, because HTTP is so variable in how large the responses are and how large the requests are, that you can kind of start getting higher transfer rate, larger files to transfer through things like post methods and whatnot. It's also much, much harder to detect. HTTP is in almost every environment, and with HTTPS, you can even start encrypting your command and control traffic without looking suspicious at all. So it's a much more effective method of command and control. I'm going to show you two slides. The two slides are just two different websites and their cookies, and not both of them are malicious, and I'm not going to tell you which one. So this is a site, and these are the cookies that are available. There's SID, HSID, SSID, you know, various different IDs / security identifiers. I'm not sure what they all are, or what they could be rather, but some strings that look like they could be base 64, They could be encoded in some other method. In general, this is a pretty common looking website headers. I have removed the addresses and endpoints to protect the innocent, but this could be a pretty common website. Additionally, here's another website. Again, remove the endpoints and the referrers, but here are the cookies. This also could be base64, we're not sure. But there's like a SES, or what could be session, user identifier, and crumb, maybe if, for knowing where the user came from or where the user has been on the site or something like that. So again, this is pretty indicative of websites that I've seen in the past on engagements. However, the second one is the malicious one. This is the C2, the educational version of the C2. And so we can see here that it's the different cookies are just base64 encoded strings. And these can be used by the server and the client to communicate things like the contents of files on the server, running route and ifconfig commands to see what networking is available, what user you're running on, stuff like that. One of the dead giveaways of the educational version, though, is the user agent. The C2 is written in Python, and the best, easiest way to do web traffic in Python is through the request library, and it has a very identifiable user agent string. If you're not familiar with user agent strings, they're basically like version numbers for the web client, the HTTP client that the user is using. So generally, you'll see something like Mozilla, whatnot. In fact, if we go back a couple slides, you'll see here that the user agent is Mozilla 5.0, and it talks about which Windows version it is and which Mozilla Firefox version it is, or Chrome or WebKit that it is. But here it's using Python. So this gives us a very clear indication and a very easy to understand way to find it, right? We just catalog all of the user agent strings that we use, and anything that is not normal is a problem, right? Usually I'm in a class when I ask this question, but just think to yourselves, how many of you in your work environment actually keep track of what user agent strings you see in your environment? I bet if you look at it, you're going to see certain user agent strings where you have near 100% clients are using them. And then you might have a smattering of different, if you've got like a mixed environment where some people are using Chrome and some people are using Firefox, or some people are using Linux and some people are using Mac or whatever, you'll see kind of a smattering of various other user agent strings, but they should be pretty analogous, or they should correlate pretty well to your user base. Your Linux Firefox user agent string should roughly correlate to the number of Linux users you have, and your Edge combined with Chrome combined with Firefox Windows user agent string should pretty much correlate to all of your Windows users, for example. If you see things that are anomalous, if you keep track of your user agent strings and you see 2 or 3, not 2 or 3%, but like 2 or 3 popping up that are like this weird odd one out, maybe it's benign, but it's certainly something that you should look into and kind of be able to explain rationally. If you can't explain it rationally, then you need to look deeper into it and figure out what actually is going on there. But what if it's more difficult than that? What if the user agent is more trivial or standardized? What if it's something that's very common? The non-educational version of the software will actually, because I work on an internal team, I know what user agent strings we use internal. If I was an external team, I would probably either set up some sort of sniffing capability on the C2 so that it can actually see what sorts of user agents are being used and then mimic those, or I can just take a look at the top user agents being used on the internet and set those as like a list of potential ones that it can use based on the operating system that it lives on. One of the things that I do on my on the professional version, or on not the professional version, I don't sell it, but the version that I use a lot is I actually have a mechanism built in where I can just launch a single command and it'll update the list of user agents based on some website that lists common user agents of the day, like what the most popular are, this week. And the reason for that is what I see a lot of times is malicious software doesn't get updated very often. And so if you see, a user agent that was current, but kind of drops off and everything else is staying current, but like these 2 or 3 user agents that are persistent in your environment are now 6 months old, 8 months old, 10 months old, etc. That's something you want to look into. It may not be malicious. It may just be that one of your systems is falling off of the patch cycle and not getting the patches that your patch management program is trying to provide it. Either way, you need to look into that and figure out why and what's going on. But that's a pretty clear indication. So I have my software actually like update itself as if it were a browser. Beyond all that, what if it's HTTPS? If you don't have HTTPS like man in the middling, through whatever next-gen firewall vendor you use, then you might not be able to see the user agents at all. You might not be able to see the command and control traffic at all. So how can you ever detect that if that's the case? Well, there's beacon detection and anomaly detection, and both of those are features of a tool called RITA, which stands for Real Intelligence Threat Analytics. It was originally developed by Black Hills Information Security, which is ran by John Strand, who coincidentally is I'm going to be teaching with at HackFest. But now it's actually ran by a company. It's funded and operated by a company called Active Countermeasures, also ran by John Strand. But what it does is it does beacon and anomaly detection through the power of math, statistical analysis. And the way you enable that is by using a network analysis tool called Bro, which Bro IDS, I think is his full title, but it's much more than an IDS. It's a network analysis tool suite. And if you're not familiar with it, please do yourself a favor, go look up some past webcasts on Bro and start looking into its capabilities. It is amazingly powerful. But it consumes Bro logs and then runs various statistical analysis on it. And the main features for C2 detection that it does is it comes up with a thing called a beacon score and a skew score. And this is where earlier in the webcast I talked about how my C2s will vary its check-in times to try and beat beacon scores. And what that means is RITA will look at a Bro capture and see something that is more or less the same beacon at the same interval all the time. So the way C2s work, like I said, it's usually client initiated and it's usually asynchronous. So what happens is the client will reach out every 5 seconds, a minute, whatever, and say, hey, do you have anything? Do you have anything? Do you have anything? Do you have anything? And eventually the C2 server will say, oh, yep, I do. But the beacons, the do you have anything, grossly outnumber the yeah, I do this. And so RITA can look at that and say, these 1,000 packets over 3 days are basically identical as far as like their packet length and contents, more or less. And they happen at 30 seconds on the dot every time. This is a very high beacon score. Now, smart hackers are like, well, if you're just looking to make sure that it happens on the 32nd every time, I'm going to add a random element. Well, they probably didn't take CS or computer science, because we all know that there is no such thing as randomness in computers. It's pseudo-random. And what happens with pseudo-random functions is that if you say, I want it to happen every 30 seconds, plus or minus 5 seconds, you will eventually over time get a, excuse me, speaking myself hoarse, you will eventually over time get a pretty close to perfect bell curve on either side of the 30 seconds. And so you'll have relatively few requests at 25 seconds and 35 seconds. And then the closer you get to 30 seconds, you'll get more and more requests. And so RITA knows that. The smart people that developed RITA are like, hey, I'm onto you, hackers, and developed a thing called skew score that will start analyzing that bell curve to see if that's what's happening. And that's the use of those two different scores. Now, RITA also has a bunch of great features on it. It'll do things like domain name analysis, subdomain analysis. So for command and control channels like DNSCat, you can actually look and say, okay, well, .com has like 80 billion subdomains. That seems reasonable because it's .com. You know, ninjas.com has 60 billion subdomains, and you're like, well, that's kind of weird because that's a lot of subdomains for a single domain name. And then under it, you'll see just a ton of randomly generated like MD5 hashes or SHA-1 hashes ninjas.com. And that is literally the way DNSCat works. Every time it does a domain request to do its C2 check-in, it needs to make sure that it gets to the command and control server. So the way it does that is it generates a random subdomain that wouldn't be cached, and then RITA can detect the fact that it's generating a random subdomain every time and say, okay, that's a lot of subdomains. We need to look into that. Now, additionally, it's got user agent string analysis. So for things like the HttpC2, you can see, okay, here's all my common user agents. 80% are this one, 15% are that one, 3, not percent, but 3 are this one. I need to take a look at that. It can also look at connection length, connection size, things like that to detect common repeating beacons throughout time. And like I said, it's a very effective tool when it comes down to finding really covert command and control channels. And I mean things that are much more covert than the two I talked about now. Things like GCAT, where it's usually actually using Gmail, something that is nigh impossible to check against because almost everyone in your environment is using it. The beacon detection and anomaly detection are really your only tools against that. So there's a webcast that John and Black Hills Information Security put on about RITA that's linked at the bottom. Highly recommend checking that out. RITA is a webcast in its own right, and in fact is many webcasts in its own right, which John has put on numerous, but also it's an entire module and lab in Sec 504. So if you come to Sec 504, there's an entire lab where you actually use RITA to analyze DNSCat, as well as a C2 called VS Agent, which is another HTTP style command and control. So with that, that's the webcast. I have quite a bit of time for Q&A, so I look forward to answering any questions you have.
First question. First of all, thanks for the webcast, and I'm pretty sure the Q&A will help other people as well. If you have questions, please ask them now. If you don't, just listen to what else we have. So, Derek, first question from James. Are you aware of any tools like RITA that is able to use other log sources if Bro isn't an option, or searches for beacon detection in SIEM like Splunk?
I'm not familiar with all of the different SIMs and log analysis softwares and whatnot. I will say that RITA is the best one I've seen. I have written custom detection using Scapy. Actually, Scapy is a phenomenal packet analysis tool as well, to try and pull out anomalous behaviors in various log sources. To replicate the type of analysis that RITA can do, it would be a lot of work inside of any SIM, is Splunk or any of the other SIMs, because you would have to basically build all of those correlation rules yourself. It can be done though. There is a paid version of RITA called AI Hunters that's actually ran by the active countermeasures team. I'm not fully familiar with what its import sources are, but that might be an avenue that you can look into.
So another question about RITA. Is RITA built into Security Onion? How hard is it to get installed and working?
That's a good question. So to my knowledge, it is not built into Security Onion. However, RITA has its own, it's really easy to install on Ubuntu. And I think it's like a couple apt-gets and then 1 or 2 like scripts to install it. It's very, very, very straightforward and it's highly documented. I haven't installed it on Security Onion specifically. I have used Security Onion because it's got Bro already installed and set up and everything. Now, what I've done in the past is when I was more an analyst and incident responder person, is that I'd have like Security Onion running and collecting all the logs, and then I'd set up scripts to export those logs and then bring them into the RITA machine. The thing about RITA is, because it does all of the math and analysis, is it's pretty CPU and IO heavy when it's doing its analysis. And as I'm sure people who are familiar with this topic are aware, things like log collection and packet analysis and packet collection is also really expensive on hardware. So I wanted to separate out those duties.
So this person said, I took 504 a few years ago. RITA was not a part of the course. Are there updates that can get me up to speed in this area?
Yeah, so RITA, I also took 504 for the first time a couple years ago, and when I took it, it also was not a part of the course. John Strand, the course author, is extremely active in keeping the course up to date and is always adding new modules and rotating out older modules. The good news is that he has, and I need to look up the actual web address for it, but he keeps a Dropbox up to date with all kinds of additional information, other webcasts that are relevant to 504, as well as things that are not part of 504 yet, but he's working on modules to put into 504. So kind of like proto 504 modules, and there's quite a bit of RITA resources in that. And so once you take 504, that Dropbox is an excellent way to kind of keep up to date on what the newer modules are doing and what the new material is. Reach out to either me or John Strand on Twitter, and we'll get that web address out to you.
All right. Next question. What is the prevalent form of obfuscated C2 being seen in the wild?
The prevalent form of obfuscated C2 in the wild is custom. Really, I tend to not use the same C2 more than a couple times. The reality is, when I was an incident responder, and I didn't touch on this earlier, but when I was doing incident response, finding and cracking the C2 was like getting the manual to their software. We were able to see how the malicious software was communicating, what it was doing on our network. It was the cheat code, it was the Konami code to our incident response. We, with near 100% confidence, could go in, contain exactly what was infected, do any sort of damage control on exactly the data that was leaked, etc. So what I found as an incident responder is that's a great goal to have. And as an adversary simulation person, I assume that my C2 is burned pretty much every op. And so I don't know. I think HTTP is probably, if I were true adversaries, I think that would be the big one. There's also some interesting stuff coming out of InGuardians where they'll use like flipping different pins on like a Raspberry Pi or various other electronics on and off really fast, generate like an electric field or a radio signal. And so I've seen out of band C2 like that. I've been playing around a little bit with SaaS software. So for instance, like utilizing OneDrive or OneNote or Google Drive and stuff like that for my command and control, because it's very ubiquitous in environments. Pretty much, I've done a little bit of Slack, some Twitter, anything that is really prevalent in the environment and has a high likelihood to get lost in the noise is going to be what's, I guess, quote unquote, prevalent.
All right, next question. Lots of legitimate software beacons. How would you score beacons?
That is an excellent question. And one of the great things about RITA is that it will actually look out at the like Alexa 500, for instance, and notify you. We'll categorize them separately. So it'll say, and this is one of the reasons that GCAT is so devious, is because it basically hides in a software that already beacons. So how do you detect that? The answer to that is I don't know. I don't have a good answer. This is something that as a community, and one of the reasons that covert command and control is such a passion of mine is because as a community, as an industry, we need to find better answers. RITA is the best tool, in my opinion, that we have right now for this. And I think as RITA is continued to improve, and as we get other tools that look at these kinds of things, we'll have better answers. But I myself, it's pretty rough once you start using things like, I've seen command and controls. This was actually a Cobalt Strike C2 profile that mimicked Spotify, and things like Palo Alto and other layer 7 firewalls were categorizing the C2 traffic as Spotify. And it's like, how do you even compete against that? Like lots of, Skype beacons, Google beacons, Spotify, any app we're running pretty much beacons out to the home server now to check for updates and things like that. So we need better we need better tools. We need better analysis. We need better anomaly detection for that. Google, the best one that I can think of is hopefully they don't update their user agents and you start seeing user agents kind of fall out of the pack.
Derek, one comment was, could you please bring up your GitHub? Maybe zoom into the
slide?
Yeah, the link so that people can read it.
Yeah, and just so you know, so here's the GitHub here. My GitHub is not super active, so don't expect to see a lot of other stuff in it, but the PyC2 is there. Also, these slides will be on the SANS website. They're usually pretty quick, like a day maybe after the webcast.
And is in Rook are those the
those are zeros? Yeah. This font doesn't show that very well, but yeah, all of my screen names are Rook zeros because my last name is evidently pretty popular.
Gotcha. Another question: aside from PS Empire and Cobalt Strike, or PowerShell Empire and Cobalt Strike, what are some other robust C2 frameworks that are keeping up with evasion /
obfuscation?
Yes, there we go.
I don't know. So beyond those two, I tend to write my own. I'm not familiar with, there's a million tools out there, and I'm sure there are other really good tools that do this kind of stuff. As far as Empire, because now it's not just PowerShell Empire, but also Python Empire are now one thing. That is an asynchronous command and control. I don't know how into evasion it gets. I haven't experimented with it very much. Cobalt Strike really is the gold standard in adversary simulation, because the malleable C2 profile, it took me a couple weeks to write the HttpC2, and I mean at least a week of that was coming up with the name, but the malleable C2 profile creation for Cobalt Strike, I could have written something very, very similar in minutes or hours. And so I really would look into that. I know it's pretty expensive for solo use, for just kind of messing around with at home, but as far as like a corporate tool set, it's cheaper than other stuff that I've seen companies buy. The one thing I will say is that the Cobalt Strike trial, you can get a Cobalt Strike trial and kind of mess around with it and see its capabilities, which is just pretty fun. It obviously is limited, but I think you can play around with the malleable C2. Don't quote me on that one though.
All right. So this one, it's not a long question, but there's a couple parts to it, so just pay attention best you can. How do real adversaries, are they receiving beacons from victims? Is this limited to one machine connects back to C2, or all compromised machines make connections back to C2? So to sum it all up, in a nutshell, is it one machine connecting back to all compromised machines?
How do adversaries do it? I've seen many ways, or I've seen it kind of all over the place. The thing about covert command and control, and I tried to address this a little bit in the earlier question on like what the popular types of command and control are. When you are either simulating an adversary, or you're looking at things like real APT, like real nation state, high sophistication actors, they are developing whatever tool set they're using, whatever tools they're using, generally for the target specifically. And so I guess it depends. I would be shocked to see a C2 where it's really just one-to-one communication. That doesn't seem very scalable to me, but I suppose if they found themselves in a situation to need it, they could develop that. What I generally do in my C2 is I'll have a command and control that can accept communications from many different clients. And so, for instance, in the HttpC2, one of those cookies is client identification, so that the C2 server knows, okay, this is this client checking in, and I have a command for it, and that's that client checking in, and I don't have a command for it. I would be surprised if many good C2s connect directly back to the actual malicious server. Much like we were talking about when earlier when we were talking about the fast Flux and the IRC days, where if you're able to find the malicious server, it gets much easier to take down. There are probably, in most C2s, and I would assume, and definitely in mine, there are obfuscation techniques where it's being routed through different web proxies, or we're using fast Flux to mask what server we're hitting. Also, there's a technique that was really popular and starting to get clamped down on by various cloud hosting technologies, but there's a technology called, or a technique called, domain fronting, where basically you use a benign server to establish a TLS connection, and once that TLS connection is established, you use the host header in the HTTP request to communicate with a different host within the same like hosting domain, within the same hosting zone or whatever. So this is something that was very popular up until very recently, and Google and Amazon have kind of clamped down on it. I believe Azure is starting to clamp down on it as well. But that's another way to start obfuscating obfuscating where your C2 actually is. And there are, I think, domain fronting is a topic in and of itself for an awesome webcast. So I didn't include it here just because it's such a large topic.
So Derek, I'm waiting for if anyone else has any questions, but I have a question for you about the class that you're getting ready to come up to teach at HackFest. When you're preparing to teach, how much preparation goes into knowing what you're going to cover on the slides and where your stories are going to come from?
Oh, so much preparation. I don't know if I've quantified it. Let's say this. Every time I teach the class, at least so far, I've taken the on-demand class just to kind of refresh myself, see if there's been any updates. You know, just to take the class. So that's at least 1-to-1. And then I practice each section probably 4 times, like out loud at normal speed before I teach. And I do each lab probably 4 or 5 times, you know, once trying to do it by memory, once by doing exactly what the book says, various things to see if I can try and predict or preempt some of the issues that students will run into. For instance, a lot of times what I'll see is you know, there will be 2 steps right next to each other, and the first one will get skipped, and that will create an error in the second one. So I try and, you know, simulate different types. I know when I take classes, I just rush through things and say, oh, I know how to do this, and then just do it. And so I try and anticipate like those kinds of students and whatnot. And then beyond that, there's just the research into various topics. Like, you know, I'll be making sure that a link works, you know, beforehand, and then I'll go to their website and say, oh, this is interesting. I didn't see this link before, and just start rabbit holing down various things. So I would say probably 8 times the teaching time, at least, probably about that.
And kind of what I was going to get into is that we're looking for more instructors, and Derek is becoming an instructor. And so if you're listening to this webcast and you want to become a SANS instructor, if you go to sans.org/teach, you'll learn more about becoming a SANS instructor. But one of the cool things that John Strand said in a meeting a long time ago is that a lot of times people want to be a wizard impressing other wizards, where what we should be is wizards bringing up the next generation of wizards. And so, Derek, what I really appreciate about you is that you know this topic and you're teaching it to the people that are listening. And so with your final thoughts, could you please talk to anyone who's thinking about becoming an instructor and encourage them to do so?
Yeah, look, it's intimidating. There have been several times in my process where I have legitimately thought, and even had conversations with my wife of just like, you know what, this is too much work. I have a full-time job, and I just don't know if I'm ready to put in that kind of effort. But a couple responses to that. One is I have not learned so much in my life in such a short period of time as I have the last 3-ish years that I've been doing my webcast. And then on top of that, even the smaller portion of time since I've started becoming a SANS instructor, I have learned so much and so many topics more deeply than I expected to, which has not only made me a better SANS instructor, but also a better employee, better at my job. Just the sheer knowledge that you get. On top of that, there's the human growth that you get, and I don't want to get too philosophical here, but the process is humbling. And what's interesting about what John said is I think that we have in this world, especially in our industry, in the security industry, this concept that when we speak at a conference, when we teach other people stuff, when we exist as people, we have to be literally perfect at everything we do. We have to be able to walk on stage, see a brand new binary that we've never seen before, and develop like 6 days in the span of 45 minutes during our talk. And that's what it takes to be an instructor. That's what it takes to be a speaker. And the reality is there no one Dave Holzer maybe exists, but like beyond that, no one is that person. We are all at different stages in our learning and our journey to be as wizard-like as we can. The reality is, I think that there are no wizards. I think there are people that are extremely good at the areas that they've really applied themselves to. But one of the cool things about interacting more with the upper tier of people that I view as far beyond me, but realizing that there are things that I know that they don't, and that while they have significant number of things that they know that I don't, I have just as much to offer the community as anyone else, because it's really, as I mentioned before, the material is first class, but the value of SANS is the experience that the instructors bring. And everyone's journey through InfoSec is unique. And the things that I experienced when I was learning things are going to be at minimum slightly skewed from how other people experience them. And my specific perspective on, oh, well, I think this is the way I think about it. Like, this is really difficult to grasp, but I kind of look at it this way, or I compare it to this thing. That insight is what helps people learn and grow. And not everybody learns the same way. So I think the more perspectives we have, the more unique, the more adversity you fought through, the better. Really, it gives us a more complete understanding of the subject matter. And yeah, I truly, I cannot express how rewarding it's been to be part of the community. Even, and I mean, I don't have a huge following. I don't have a giant channel, but the people I do interact with, it's been very, very rewarding, and I'm very appreciative of the ability, the opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of. And if you have the same opportunities, maybe it's not for you, I understand, but I highly, highly encourage you to at least explore it and give it some solid thought and consideration.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. Let's turn it over to Carol to finish today. Thank you all very much for tuning in. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them or send them to us afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Derek and Jason, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.